Let me introduce Abby. Abby Holovach. Abby is a passionate EHS professional with diverse experience in state and federal environmental regulation, hazmat and waste management, emergency spill response, and EHS regulatory management and implementation. Currently, HALT, CAT's environmental compliance manager. Some of her previous roles include environmental investigator in the waste section of Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, EHS and waste director at a hazmat spill response company, and a spill stank environmental management system program manager at a Joint Reserve military base. She is also the founder owner of an environmental compliance assistance firm, Vive Environmental. Additionally, she is the founder of DFW Environmental Pros, a free, no-strings-attached environmental networking organization in DFW area. Outside of work, she enjoys lattes, long naps, and the company of her critters and family. Abby.
Well, thank you. Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, let me get all this out of the way. All right. So I am going to take myself off video because I'll try to make eye contact with myself and that just doesn't work. So, okay. So like she said, my name is Abby Holovach. You guys can see my screen okay?
Yes, it looks right.
Okay, perfect. All right, so my little bar at the bottom is not going away, but that's okay. So we're going to go through some common waste management pitfalls, basically things that I've seen during waste investigations in particular, and I've seen this from both perspectives. So from the regulator side and from the folks that are being, regulated. So I've both done these investigations and been on the side of being investigated. So these are just kind of some of the tips that I want to share with you guys that will hopefully help you maybe avoid some common waste management pitfalls that could potentially lead to violations. There we go. Okay, so kind of on the environmental spectrum, we've got, in terms of, the environmental world, we've got sustainability on one side and then just basic environmental compliance on the other side. So, just basic compliance with the regulations, not going above and beyond, not into all of the really awesome sustainability stuff that everybody's been talking about. I've spent more of my career just kind of on the basic environmental compliance side, like trying to get people to follow the basic environmental regulations, which is a feat within itself. When you're working with people maybe who don't have a whole lot of experience with the environmental world, they're not familiar with the regulations or what their responsibilities are. So that's kind of the viewpoint, the perspective as we go through the next few pages, is looking at it more so, I'm not going to focus so much on sustainability, but more so just basic environmental compliance, how you can avoid violations, how you can prevent spills, potential releases to the environment. So just as we move through the presentation, I just kind of wanted to, bring that up that, there's no bees making honey here. It's just, don't pour that used oil in that hole in the ground. So good times. I've seen a little bit of everything with that. So for basic areas of focus that we're going to go through. So first of all, kind of two main chunks of waste management review that we're going to focus on. So the first one is going to be, things like paperwork. So paperwork review and records reviews. So that could be waste classifications and characterizations, waste documentation like manifests, land disposal restrictions, inspection records. So everything that's rolled up under the paperwork requirements when it comes to waste management. And then we'll also talk about some field review of like operational and waste management areas. So when it comes to waste storage, waste labeling, we'll also go through a few things for those and some common issues that could potentially lead to violations. And really both are equally important because they're both going to affect each other in the final outcome of an inspection. Because if you drop the ball on one, let's say that your paperwork is terrible, but your waste area looks great, you're managing all your waste responsibly, regardless, it's still going to affect how an auditor or investigator is going to look at the rest of your facility. So you want to make sure that you've got both your waste on point, your waste management, waste storage, and then also all of the paperwork on point. Like I said, if you're weak in one area but strong in the other, then it just kind of brings both down. So when you're evaluating your waste management practices and your programs, you really want to look critically at both your waste management operations and your waste management documentation. So like I said, if one's strong but the other is weak, then that's just going to have a net negative impact on that investigation. So throughout our slides, you'll see these eyes popping up. So these are your investigator eyes. So what this means is when you're reviewing your waste management practices, or really any of your environmental practices across the board, so whether it's any media from water, air, waste, whatever it may be, you want to make sure you're reviewing it from a critical perspective. So using those investigator eyes, like what would an investigator think if they walked up on this? So that means cutting yourself no slack. You're not giving yourself any excuses. You're not making the excuse of, well, we've been really busy. That's why, there's spills on the ground and open containers. Because none of that's going to work or fly for an investigator. Because you got to remember, when an investigator shows up, they have no clue regarding your company's, what they call tribal knowledge. So like, what your team is used to doing, their practices. They may have a tote for used oil, and everybody knows it's for used oil, but it's not labeled as used oil. So how is an investigator supposed to know? So you want to make sure that if it's not obvious or super clear, then you can safely assume it's not going to be sufficient for demonstrating compliance to an investigator. So like I said, not cutting yourself any slack at all is key for using those investigator eyes. And at times it may feel a little painful and nitpicky. For example, I was preparing for an announced investigation, and so I went around the facility and literally looked in every single trash can. And yes, I looked as big of a freak as one would think I would look, looking in every single trash can. Everybody was looking at me like I was a weirdo, and it was really awkward. But nevertheless, it needed to be done. And then sure enough, when the investigator showed up, what did she do? She looked in every single trash can. So it's really important that you're being nitpicky on yourself. So it may be painful, a little cringy, but it's really important. It's for your benefit to do so. So as we go through, you'll see those little eyes pop up, and it's basically reminding us to think like an investigator when it comes to our environmental compliance. I see some things in the chat. Do I need to check? I just want to make sure everybody can hear. Perfect. Okay. Okay, so first one here, we're going to focus on the paperwork aspect in terms of waste classifications. So when it comes to waste classifications or your waste characterizations, is it hazardous? Is it non-hazardous? Is it universal waste? Is it falling under a solid or hazardous waste exemption? It's crucial that you feel 100% confident about that waste classification and characterization. So can you easily locate and present and explain the classification? Because if an investigator or an auditor shows up and, you're like, that's not going to make them feel very good or confident in your abilities in terms of your waste management practices. So if you're fumbling and bumbling on waste characterization questions or providing that information, it's going to plant seeds of doubt in that investigator's mind. So they're going to call into question, like I said, the rest of your waste management practices. They're going to think they don't even know how they determined this waste was non-hazardous. So now I really feel the need to dig into everything, which is obviously what everybody wants to avoid, is extra scrutiny during an inspection. So I always recommend either digitally or within a binder, but you have one place for each facility where all of their waste stream classification documentation is located. So including all of your safety data sheets, analytical testing, any generator knowledge descriptions, approved waste profiles to those disposal or recycling facilities, any of that. So you want to have all of it readily available, because it will really impress an investigator if you're just able to whip that out on a moment's notice. If they point to a waste container and say, well, how did you determine that that was, class 1 non-hazardous waste here in Texas? You can just go and whip that thing right out, and then they're going to be very pleased and then go on their merry way. So really sets you up for success. And it's also important to note that a lot of folks use a waste management company, so a vendor, to help them with their waste classifications and profiles, but you don't want to let that lull you into a false sense of security. You still need access to these profiles and all of that backup documentation. So never assume that somebody's got it handled or somebody's got your back, because it's happened where you'll be in the heat of the moment, there's a surprise investigation, and the investigator's asking for this information and you can't get a hold of your broker. And so that's a really bad time. So you want to make sure you have it prepared and ready ahead of time. Because investigators really do love when you can provide that documentation in this nice, tidy package, because it's really helping build that trust that you know what you're doing. And then when it comes to any exemptions you might be utilizing, so any solid or hazardous waste exemptions, so let's say you send off-spec fuel for recycle, you want to make sure you're maintaining all of that documentation very carefully and particularly, because these exemptions are great, but you have to be able to support and defend the fulfillment of those exemption requirements, not only for yourself, but also for the recycler that you're using. So you want to ask yourself when you're looking at your waste classifications and all of your documentation, am I able to prove this? And if you have any, doubts, or you're like, ooh, I don't feel comfortable with that, you want to make sure ahead of time, now is the time to get all of those ducks in a row. So with your investigator eyes, when it comes to waste classifications, always ask yourself, can I prove it? All right, so waste labeling. Let me check the chat. I see somebody. Yes, I believe that they would provide copies of the presentations. Okay, so I want that bottom thing to go away. There we go. Okay, waste labeling. So asking yourself, when you look at your waste area and you're looking at your waste management, in your containers, whether it's totes, drums, tanks, roll-offs, whatever it is it immediately identifiable without question? So when it comes to waste labeling, the faster that someone can ID the contents, the easier life's going to be for everyone. So for me, my preference is having waste labels on the tops and sides of the waste container, because that way, whether it's you, a guest, a new employee, or an investigator, they're not having to do an entire 360 walk around the waste container trying to find the label. They can simply walk by and easily spot it and see it. And it also helps if someone's lining up your containers, let's say putting them into rows. I've seen it where totes will get pushed together and then you can't see that front label anymore. So it's important that those labels are visible from all angles. And it also helps when it's getting ready to be loaded for shipment. That way, no matter how that material is being shipped, whatever angle they're loaded at, we're able to tell exactly what's in those containers. And so, like I said before, it's important that we don't allow ourselves that, give ourselves any leeway when it comes to historical working knowledge of the area. Like I said, that tribal knowledge, just because people might know that blue drum is for used rags. If it doesn't say exactly what it is, then how is an investigator supposed to know? So we want to make sure that all those waste containers, no matter what its purpose is or how long it's been there, all waste containers need to be clearly labeled. You want to ask yourself, could any Joe Schmo walking in off the street identify the containers? And if that's not the case, then you need to rethink how it's labeled. So, I've seen containers that are just with a paint pen, it just says waste. And you're like, okay, well, I'm glad you're at least saying it's waste, but what is it? You got to take it a step further and actually apply waste labels and identify it. So there shouldn't be any questions of what is that? It should be very easy for someone to tell. Also, if you have old labels, if maybe it's a container that was cleaned out and reused for something else, you want to make sure any old labels are covered. So once again, shouldn't be any question if there's an old product label on there and then you've also got a non-haz label. Well, that's going to raise red flags. That's going to make people ask questions. And you want to make it clear, is it waste and not a product? So we'll talk about that with waste storage in a minute, but obviously you don't want to store waste and product together. Because if there are those two things mixed together and you've got, old product labels on waste containers, now you're just creating a hot mess for yourself during an inspection. And you don't want to have the investigator constantly asking, what's this, what's that, what's this, what's that? Because that's just going to make the inspection more difficult as a whole. So ensuring that the waste containers are using the correct waste labels as well. I've seen the case where somebody got a hold of a universal waste label roll and they just were labeling everything as universal waste. It didn't matter what it was, they were just slapping those bad boys everywhere. So you want to make sure whoever's responsible for those waste management areas is properly trained on which labels they need to use. So I've made quick guide labels in the past where those who are working in those areas, this little quick guide is just specific to their working area and the types of waste that they handle and manage. So that way it's easy for them to identify what waste label they need to use. And it's also important that you're indicating accumulation time limits. So if you're a small quantity or large quantity generator, they're required to indicate their time limits on hazardous waste. So how long have they had that hazardous waste? So if you do have hazardous waste on site and you are an SQG or LQG, you're going to need that date on there of your starting accumulation. The investigators will definitely be looking for that. So it's just important that, those labels are legible. If they've been sitting outside, they've been weathered, obviously a faded, crusty, illegible label is just as useless as if it wasn't labeled at all. And then lastly on this, one thing that I love is signage. So if you have signage for your particular waste management areas, once again, it's going to make an investigation super duper easy. If you've got a sign that says, hazardous waste management area, maybe you've got a universal waste management area or an area specifically for non-hazardous waste. Another one I see a lot are, areas just for empty containers. So just having a simple sign that says empty. What that'll do during an investigation is versus the investigator, having to ask a million questions, they can just breeze on through and say, oh, empty containers over here. There's your universal waste area. Again, it eliminates those questions. They really do love to see readily identifiable waste areas, and it also shows once again that you take environmental compliance seriously. So signage is a great way to stay organized and compliant. And then just to note, if you have empty containers, like I said, you want to make sure that those are clearly indicated as empty as well. Otherwise, the investigator will go around every container and shake it and see if there's something inside. So if you can eliminate that question ahead of time, then you'll be in good shape. So when you're assessing your waste labeling practices, always ask yourself, is it immediately identifiable without question? Waste storage. So this is a big one. Asking yourself, what are you doing to prevent a release? Are you doing what it takes to prevent a release? Because proper waste storage is going to be crucial for compliance. We want to make sure that wherever we're picking our waste area, if we're setting up a new waste management area or maybe we're looking to start a new one, move it, we want to pick an area, first of all, that has limited access. So in that second photo, you can kind of see there's a bay door in the back. So that's not an ideal storage area. If you're picking an area where it's, super busy, you've got a lot of people rolling through, somebody could go through in there on a forklift and accidentally back up into those and, knock that entire thing over, which is clearly going to cause an issue. So avoiding those busy areas. If you can get an area that's gated, fenced, where it's, completely limited access, that is best case scenario. That way you're keeping unwanted hands off of the waste containers, you're helping prevent unintended releases or spills, and it's really important that you're consolidating in those specific areas. So I've seen some facilities where they just have waste containers everywhere, just spread out all over the place, so it looks terrible, it's really messy, it makes it hard to track. So designating specific areas for your waste in areas that are not busy with limited access is ideal. You also want to ensure that you're not storing containers directly on the soil, directly on the gravel or grass. A lot of times there are space issues, but you kind of just have to try to make do to avoid having to do that. So whether that's getting mobile containment pallets, they also have things you can buy off of Grainger and Uline that are, the self-contained. They've got little roll down doors where you can store drums. But anything you can do to avoid storage on permeable surfaces is ideal. So the more protection you can have from the elements, the better off you're going to be, which is going to prevent spills, leaks, weathering, exposure, protects your waste labels as well. And then a no-brainer, obviously avoiding drains or waterways. And we would think that that's a no-brainer, but I've seen it a million times. You walk up and there's literally a drum sitting right next to the drain and you're like, do you not see? Why are you doing this? Please move it. So it happens. People just aren't paying attention. They get busy and you start finding drums in all sorts of inappropriate places. And then another big piece to storage as well is the container integrity. So are the containers bulging? Are they rusting? Leaking containers is obviously a no-no. Old crusty drums. If they get to a point to where they're so dilapidated, no longer DOT shippable, then you're looking at having to repackage. You may have to overpack. So the more you can protect the drums or your waste containers in general, the better off you'll be. And then making sure all the containers are fully closed. So this is a big one that regulators hit waste generators with a lot in terms of violations, or open containers. So if it's a container where they're actively adding waste, very frequently throughout the day, you really have to keep your eye on those containers, or find ways. Maybe there's different funnel systems or something that have built-in lids and latches. But you want to make sure you're keeping an eye on that, because if a regulator spots any open container at all, whether it's a tote with a lid missing or a drum lid askew, all those things could potentially be violations. So making sure all those containers are fully closed. And then if you are an LQG, they are required to store their hazardous waste at least 50 feet from the property line for ignitable and reactive wastes. So just something else to keep in mind when you're picking a designated area. And then, like I mentioned before, making sure that your waste is stored completely separate from product. Some people have a tendency, they want to put, let's say, like just all drums in one place, and then they end up mixing product and waste. So it makes it very hard to tell what's product versus waste. So that's always a bad practice. So whether it's just even, cones between the two areas or some divider, it needs to be very clear which area is for waste and which area is for product. So as you're planning out how you're managing your waste, how you're storing it, where you're going to do it, you ultimately want to ask yourself, with those investigator eyes, am I doing what it takes to prevent a release? And then one of our final chunks here, so waste documentation. So this covers a lot, obviously, but the big thing to ask yourself here is, am I ready for an inspection today? And what that means is, do you have all your ducks in a row? Like we talked about at the beginning. If an investigator shows up and you're able to pull all this stuff out and you're ready to go, that's a really great tone for the rest of the investigation. Investigators love to see binders. A lot of times if you're have an unannounced visit, it's going to be a little more difficult to have quite the nice and tidy bow, but it's still possible. It's still, obviously get everything organized that you're responsible for. But if you have a planned, announced investigation, it's really going to tickle the investigators if you have a regulatory binder just for them set up and ready to go. I've been on that side of the investigation many times, had a binder prepared and ready to go, and every single time I can tell they're just like, oh, look at that. Like, it makes them feel good, warm fuzzies. Most recent one, an investigator told me she goes, wow, you went really hard. Because I presented her with this binder that had like every last thing possible she could want to see, that I knew she was going to want to see in terms of what the facility was responsible for waste management. So having that binder, having that documentation just immediately ready to go, whether that's your waste documentation, like your manifests, your land disposal restrictions, your records for inspections, any waste characterization records, any personnel training. So those who are signing, let's say, for example, hazardous waste manifest are required to have hazmat transportation training, RCRA training. So you want to have copies of all of that stuff there and ready to go. So having it readily available and readily accessible is going to put that investigator at ease. And again, you're building that trust between the two parties that everyone's goal is environmental compliance. And there will be times, I know, like for me, there's a lot of sites where I'm not physically there if you're managing multiple facilities. So it's important that you get with the personnel who are on site to equip them and train them for, let's say, like a surprise investigation. So you don't want your managers on site to be caught off guard or deer in headlights if an investigator walks in and you've never spoken to them like what they're supposed to do in that circumstance. So it's really important that you're training personnel on those locations what they need to do if an investigator comes through the door. So what I've done in the past, and depending on your regulatory status and requirements, it could be as simple as like just a laminated sheet that just, says basic information like all environmental regulatory records and documentation are immediately available upon request. Please direct all inquiries and questions to, your environmental person and any record and documentation requests. So just by having like a basic sheet that kind of gives your on-site managers and an incoming investigator instructions on what needs to happen here, it's going to take that pressure off your site manager as well to feel like they need to answer all these questions that the investigator is asking. And it just kind of equips everybody, puts them at ease, knowing that, okay, the environmental compliance person is not here on site, but they do have the information readily available. And as long as we just write down all the questions, we're going to be able to provide it pretty much immediately after the fact. So that's really great all the way around for everybody involved. I've had it where, sometimes a manager may feel pressure to try to answer all their questions, and maybe they don't answer correctly. So just making sure you train your personnel on site so they're equipped and ready for a surprise inspection. And then I'll show you guys in a minute a really great way to prepare for an inspection, whether it's a surprise inspection or an announced. But you want to make sure that you know what an investigator is going to be looking for. What waste documentation specifically are you responsible for according to the regulations, and having each and every single one of those things ready to go. So you want to ask yourself, are you ready for an inspection today? And if the answer is no, then that's when you want to start to game plan. Okay, what can I do to be better prepared? And so you've heard me say this a few times, warm fuzzies. So that really is the best defense for avoiding violations. Obviously, being in compliance is the first. Then you don't have to worry about it. But nevertheless, if you can give an investigator or an inspector those warm fuzzies, the better off you're going to be. So, really what that means is if you're able to show them through your waste management practices, through your documentation, we take environmental compliance seriously. And you're able to show them and prove to them with your documentation, with your records. They go out and walk your facility and they can tell their signage, things are labeled, you guys do regular inspections, your housekeeping is on point. All of these things are going to be able to put their mind at ease. Like I talked about before, that nicely organized binder, all of these things give them those warm fuzzies. So if they show up and you're like scrambling and sweating, and like I said before, that hold on, let me in your waste management area looks like a dump or whatever, it's not going to bode well. Whether you're in compliance or not, if an investigator gets a rock in their shoe about it, they can dig hard enough to find something. So you just want to make sure that you're not only giving them those warm fuzzies, but you're making their lives easier too during that inspection, because they will appreciate it. But if you start off on the bad foot, those warm fuzzies aren't there. Let's say someone has a bad attitude, on your side, which I've seen that, investigator shows up and people get all stanky. That's just not helpful to anyone. It will set that investigator on guard. They may want to dig deeper into your records and into your waste management practices, because maybe you're showing them you don't really know what you're doing, or that your facility is not taking compliance seriously. Which in turn is going to harden that investigative armor, because now you're showing them maybe you're of questionable compliance commitment and status. So by reviewing all of your practices and all of your records with those investigator eyes and holding yourself to those same standards as what an investigator is looking for, you can better prepare yourself and your team for an inspection. And like I mentioned before, not cutting yourself any slack based upon how the facility has been super busy or whatever the excuse may be. Regardless, an investigator is not going to care how busy the facility has been if you're out of compliance. So, like we said, really important to give them those warm fuzzies. It just shows that you take environmental compliance seriously, and you're trying to make their jobs easier as well, which they're going to appreciate. So, clearly, if you do have regulatory violations present, giving those investigators those warm fuzzies doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be spared, but it can help your cause. If you're showing a good faith effort, that's going to go a long ways. So this is a resource that, for example, TCEQ offers. So here in Texas, which is really amazing, I'm really glad that they do this. They offer all of their investigative checklists online. So whether it's waste, air, water, they're all available on here. So you're actually able to go in and get the exact same checklist that they're going to be using to use like at your facility. So that's what I did as part of my pre-investigation preparation with that recent inspection. Was I printed off the checklist and I actually went through and completed them all ahead of time. Not only does that make sure that our facility is in compliance and I'm not missing anything, but it also is, it makes the investigator chuckle when you pull out their own checklist and like slide it towards them across the table and it's already filled out. So again, contributing to the warm fuzzies. But it's important that you're doing these regularly, because you want to make sure that you're up to date with any of the latest regulations. Maybe there's been some new updates to the checklists. So you want to check periodically to see what's going on there. And then make sure you're maintaining those completed checklists in your files as you do them periodically so you can show your due diligence, show that good faith effort to ensuring environmental compliance. So, just another way to give them warm fuzzies, and it's truly a great resource. And I know that other states offer the equivalent. Some do. But if you're in a state potentially that doesn't offer, like they're not just putting out their investigative checklists, then you can always go in and just make one for yourself. Like all they did was go through and list out all of the applicable citations, and then you can pull out the requirements within those citations and basically make your own checklist. So you go through and really critically use these checklists to evaluate your compliance. So these are awesome. I love these investigative checklists. And then just as a summary here, so like we just saw, utilizing those investigative checklists to check yourself. So great way to use your investigator eyes. You're literally looking at it from their perspective. And as you're doing that, you're not cutting yourself any slack. You're not going easy on yourself during an inspection because you know that investigator is not going to go easy on you. So using those investigator eyes. For waste and product containers, you want to make sure that they're clearly labeled and identified because your goal is to eliminate the question during an inspection, what's that? They shouldn't ever have to ask that, what's that? Like it should be immediately obvious what that is. Same for the signage, like we said, that's super helpful in answering that question, what's that? Because it's eliminating those questions. And then thinking about your worst case scenario. So if you're choosing a waste management area location, you're picturing what is the worst case scenario with the area that I've chosen. Where's the drain? Is access limited? Are the containers on an impermeable surface? So you're doing everything you can, like we said before, to prevent a spill or release. And then having that binder ready with all of the applicable waste management documentation requirements, everything that you're responsible for and you've checked with the checklist, is going to make a surprise investigation so much easier. And I've seen it a million times where people at the facility will gritch and moan about all these crazy things you're doing, but then as soon as they undergo an inspection or investigation, they're like, oh, okay, I see why you were looking in every trash can. So just get everybody on board, getting your team to use their investigator eyes as well, pulling other people in to help with your inspections. That way, it's kind of an ongoing, it takes a village, basically. So if you and your team can get those investigator eyes, you're going to be in good shape when it comes to waste management. And that's the end. That's all I got.
Thank you, Abby. We have quite a few questions already in the chat.
Okay.
Can you run through the proper way to complete a progress knowledge form? Is this a specific TCEQ form or can you have a facility-focused form?
Let me go here. Okay, so the process knowledge, so usually where this is going to be documented is on like a disposal facility's waste profile. So, before any waste gets sent for disposal or recycling, they're going to want a waste profile completed. So you're basically giving a biography of that waste stream. And within that waste profile, there's literally going to be a box that says waste generation description. And within that, that's where you have to go down and break down exactly how this waste stream was generated. And I've seen where people have said things like within that box, they'll just say wastewater. And you're like, okay, well, that's not good enough. So when someone's asking for process knowledge, they want to know from start to finish how this material was generated, anything it could have come in contact with. So, what chemicals are involved, any other potential contaminants. So any of that information is going to be included within that waste profile form. So that's generally where you see the process knowledge information documented.
Thank you. The next one is, do you have an example or format of a good spiral notebook to present an investigator?
Yeah, totally. What I can do is send a little table of contents to you after the meeting, and then you can send it out to whoever wants it. But I would love to share, like I said, my table of contents just to kind of provide an example outline of the different categories and information I'm including within that notebook.
Awesome, thank you. And then the next one is it a SWIP checklist? I think they're referring to the checklist that you were talking about earlier.
So in terms of, I'm not sure if this means I know that there's SWIP checklists within those investigative checklists that TCEQ offers. So that's super helpful. So they're, like I said, they have air and water inspection checklists as well that you can utilize. Is that what the question was referring to?
Yes, you were going over the checklist for investigation, and I think that's what they were. Is this the same as SWIP checklist?
Yeah, they have that option as well. The TCQ does make that one available as well. So I'll include that in my notes that I sent after the fact, so you guys can just click on that link and it'll take you right to all of the available checklists.
And then the last one, what's the most ridiculous violation you have ever seen?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably the most just kind of ridiculous situation in general. I wasn't personally on this investigation, but some investigators went out to a facility. It was an industrial facility, and I can't recall what they were making, but they clearly had had a release outside. There was, these acid vats, and this huge area was stained with acid. So clearly an issue. They'd been having releases. So this was discussed, while they're on site. The investigators leave for lunch, and the facility proceeds to aggressively and as fast as they can paint over the entire floor area with the staining. Like that somehow was going to solve the problem. So, the investigators come back and there's like yellow paint just like everywhere. They're like, what is this? That doesn't solve the problem at all. So just bizarre things like that where people think that that's going to, fix the issue. It doesn't.
Wow. That is ridiculous.
Yes.
Another question coming in. How physical are investigator roles considering people with certain physical limitations?
It's actually pretty flexible. A gal that I came in with when I first started working at TCQ, she became pregnant with her first baby about 6 months in. And for her, she was able to focus more so on landfill operations. While the rest of us would go out to industrial and hazardous waste facilities. So that way she wasn't being exposed to hazardous chemicals. She was able to go out and do other types of investigations. And we had all sorts of folks on our team. So that's one nice thing about that role. There is a lot of back office work, but there's also, more pertaining to lifting. I never had to lift anything. We'll put it that way. I mainly just, unless you count a clipboard. I wasn't really much, we were not encouraged to go move anything around or, anything like that. So no, there was no lifting involved.
Thank you. Those were some great questions. If you have any more, would I be able to do this job with mobility aids?
I would think so. Like I said, it's pretty flexible, and especially depending on what media you're in. I mean, there's some media that are some of the water side of it where they're having to go down and collect water samples down by the river and this and that. But then there's also some of the other departments where it's much more, you're just walking or you're just, on the permit side or whatever it may be. So there's a whole lot of a variety when it comes to opportunities within TCEQ.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you for the presentation. That was really some great information. And when I saw that picture with neatly laid out drums, that doesn't happen in real world. I don't think that that must have been a staged picture.
Exactly. Yep. You would be correct. It's tough. So.
Well, thank you again.
Thanks, y'all.
So we're moving.